Yeah, so I am here with Kate Sassy Sassoon. Um, would you like to introduce yourself, Kate, or shall I call you Sassy?
I actually like people to choose, so y'all can choose your favorite one. Sassy is a popular choice, but I like to learn what people think they should call me. I've got a variety of nicknames, and yeah, I'm what I call a native co-opper. A friend of mine nicknamed me that recently, in that I was really born and raised in a kind of diversity of cooperative contexts. So when I was 3 years old, my mom made rent and childcare and food by living in what I would now call a leasehold co-op, where a bunch of folks intentionally renting a place together, sharing their childcare, food, and housing needs. Then I moved to Los Angeles, or first I moved to Virginia, where my grandparents were a part of a local farming cooperative and had a cooperative farmers market. Then I moved to LA. Daycare co-op is how we survived, and those people are still my extended family, and we have holiday meals together every year. Then I went to college and got to go to college and come out debt free, because of a housing co-op, right? So the Berkeley Student Co-ops were where I first was housed in a cooperative, and then it was actually my first board facilitation role in a co-op. So I was the elected board rep from my house, and really got my first taste of formal democratically owned and operated businesses. I had been in them and receiving the benefits of them before that, but then I was suddenly part of the crew, part of the governance body of the organization. And that brought me to a discovery that I really love facilitating long, contentious board meetings. It's not everybody's truth. I find them fascinating, especially when they're full of passion and agency, and it's really trying to find a good solution together. And I really love doing that. So that's kind of how I got here. I started training in facilitation and kind of popular education pedagogy when I was about 14, and I kept going with that. And those things together, plus a lot of energy and a background in theater and science, made it really kind of obvious to me once I left college and left that housing co-op that co-ops were the way, and helping to support them and run them and make them even better was the way for me. And so since then, I've been kind of a serial worker owner and co-op participator, and run my own business in between the times when I've been a member owner or worker owner of various kinds of co-ops or worker self-directed nonprofits. Just going to other co-ops across sectors, helping bring lessons from one place to another, and helping people who are having friction just get do our things together better. So that's kind of me
Great.
and why I'm at this crazy.
Nice. So yeah, you mentioned a whole lot of things in there. One of them that piqued my interest, just this is a personal interest of mine, I guess you could say, the babysitting co-op. I'm interested in what, can you just tell me a little bit of detail on
Yeah.
what that was and how that worked?
Yeah, so so you talking about the first one when I was a little kid, or the daycare co-op?
You said, I think maybe when you were a little kid, you said something that kept you guys going was
Yeah. My mom lived in a house. They rented a house with three other single moms, and because they were single moms who were either sharing custody or didn't have another parent to share that custody with, they had childcare needs when each of them needed to go out to work, and so they just organically kind of created a system where, when one of them was on shift, one of them, or one or two of them, would be taking care of the kids and the house at the same time. So they just really kind of organically made a village inside their house in a very kind of leasehold co-op way. And I don't know the exact details because we haven't talked like, how did it work?
Mhm.
When were you on shift? What was the system? Did you use clothespins or a whiteboard? But we really, the what I understand of it was that because they had each other in this housing co-op, and they were
Right.
we as kids trusted the other moms, they were
Mhm.
able to actually get jobs and maintain jobs that it would be really a struggle for them to maintain as single parents.
Right. Yeah. So they were providing babysitting basically for and childcare for each other. The three of them in the house. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, nice. I asked because my mother, um, started a babysitting co-op at
Mhm.
married student housing at
Yeah.
Montana State University in Bozeman when my
Yep.
dad was in college, and did kind of a similar thing, but just with like all the women on the at the end of the cul-de-sac and
Yep. Yep.
so yeah,
Very
great.
common, and I love those kinds of examples because they're cooperative, but they're so you wouldn't necessarily count them in a co-op census,
Oh yeah,
but they
it's
are
totally
so
cooperative,
very
but
endemic.
you don't need to incorporate to do a co-op. You can be very low overhead. My mom in her group, their thing was they used poker chips to keep track of who had
Go.
worked how many hours and stuff, and made sure everybody was balancing out. So
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. And yeah, I love that mutual aid, cooperation, and co-ops are like a subset of mutual aid, but it's a much broader category, even if they all partake of some of the same structures, which is what I love because then I get to support more of them because the structures are fun to tweak.
yeah. Can you tell me a little bit in your survey response? You mentioned said your first stint as a worker owner was at Nabalom. Am I
Yeah.
saying
So
that right?
you are, in fact, it's Nabalom Collective Bakery. We had a very close relationship, historically, less so by the time I arrived, because it was started in, I believe, 1976. A sister city or a sister relationship with, I can't remember the name of the town, but it was in Latin America, a specific town that had Nabalom. This was a word in their language that they had a particular like way of being and being with each other. Ooh, did I lose you? Or are you still here?
No, I am still here.
You're
Sorry,
still here. Spotlighted me. I love it.
I should have warned you. I just yeah.
Excellent. I love it. So Nabalom Collective Bakery had very deep anarchist, specifically anarchist international solidarity roots, was coming to the practice of making a business very much from the lens of we are, an anti-capitalist organization. So it's a very fun needle to thread being an explicitly anti-capitalist for-profit business. That's a little bit hard, especially because when I arrived, they were dealing with one downstream outcome of that not being done well. Specifically, there had been a person who was, there was some breakdown in their systems, and a person who was a tax war resistor, which is a very valid thing to be, was also their financial committee lead and chose not to file taxes for several years as a business. And the IRS came calling with a $125,000 bill, which for a bakery with the margins that are so thin in that industry was, for most businesses, would have been a death knell. For that business, because it had centered community care and good work in its operations and in its marketing and its presence, it survived. It had such good community relations that it was able to secure a community sourced loan and crowdfund at least a substantial portion of the remainder that was left over from the loan, and then have a payback period that was actually sane and non-extractive. And so I joined the company when it was it was like, fair warning, you want to sign up and become a member. We have a big bill over our head and we're working to clear it, and we're actively trying to grow the business to do that with more speed and sustainability. And so it was essentially a turnaround effort, which it's hard work running a bakery cafe. Baking, making pastries, being a barista is physically demanding and logistically challenging work, and it was delightful. It was absolutely minimum wage, but it was absolutely delightful, and it was a real lesson to me in how so many of my experiences in the other kinds of co-ops I've been a part of really carried over, in that what you're doing can actually matter less in terms of its impact on you than how you're doing it. And how you're doing it in a co-op is together with agency. And that matters so much in so many tangible and intangible ways. Tangible, like, for example, when we could decide what was acceptable behavior in the staff, and we could decide that we were going to uphold each other to that standard. And so if someone felt like they were being sexually harassed at work, we could decide when that was true, how to deal with it, and what we wanted as our outcome for that. And that was a completely community owned process. And also, like, intangible, I felt like I mattered at my job. I felt like I wasn't anybody's underling. I felt like I was 1/15th of the boss. And that really mattered to how it felt to spend, 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. every Sunday making 200 croissants, right? Like that really just mattered in how I carried myself, in how I experienced the world, and how I was not alienated from my own power during that time. So yeah, there's a lot in there. It's just real great and real formative and real challenging.
Yeah, yeah, that's quite the story. Uh, you definitely, if the person doing your bookkeeping and accounting and all that is an anarchist, you might just make sure they're paying the taxes. You
We
can't
learned. We
do
learned
that.
from that
Yes,
situation. We are
learn the
like,
hard way.
you can be a tax war resistor, but maybe not here with
Yeah.
this money.
Right. Yes. Exactly. Do that with your personal finances. Yeah, and I don't know if you've seen. There's a video that somebody, a European couple, did a tour through the U.S. and they went to a bunch of worker co-ops, including, of course, the Arizmendi bakeries, and talked with Tim Hewitt. And he talks about this kind of conundrum of being an anarchist, anti-capitalist, and running a business, and getting some pushback from other anarchist anti-capitalists about doing that. And his response was, well, what are you doing? Okay, so
Yeah.
go and work at Walmart, and complain about your boss. At least
Right.
we have the autonomy, we have our own revenue streams, that at
Yeah.
least it's like, yeah, we live in a world that is highly impure, so you're not gonna be able to make everything perfect. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm
that's great.
definitely much more of a pragmatist in my approach. Like even in how I support co-ops and what even I define as a co-op, I'm kind of aggressively model agnostic. I don't
Mhm.
think that there is a way, right? If you're
Yeah.
talking about co-ops, even just co-ops specifically, right? Like a co-op is an autonomous group of people coming together to serve the needs, goals, and aspirations of the people inside it and served by it. Like
Yeah.
I would add who's there today and who you want to be there tomorrow. But that that can mean a whole heck of a lot of things. That may
Yeah. Yeah.
mean a poker chip wielding group of moms. It may mean a, multi-layered 5 stakeholder in that internationally incorporated LCA. It could mean so many things that I don't actually have a lot of time to waste on purism. I think it's not actually going to help. I'd rather get down to writing some bylaws, please.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and I love that term you use, model agnosticism. It's one I know from uh, you know not co-op stuff, talking about like
Mm.
philosophy of science and whatnot. But yeah, no, it's perfect. Yeah, applied here. There's no panaceas, I like to say. There's right. And
There's context and what we can do
yeah,
with it. Mm.
and I'd just like to touch on a little bit what you said about the experience of working at that
Mm.
bakery. Uh,
Mhm.
as a worker owner, and just the extreme importance, which I think maybe people who don't work in manual labor service jobs don't really
Mhm.
understand as much. If you've been more of a like office worker, nonprofit,
Mhm.
academic kind of um, jobs, how degrading those jobs are, not because of the work itself,
Yeah.
but because of how you're treated, and that
Yeah.
the difference between being the overnight baker, which is what I did when I worked at the bakery for a year and a half,
Mhm.
was I
Yep.
was baking off the croissants that somebody else had made on the 2 to 10 shift, and I was
And
on 10
together
to
we
6.
are strong.
Yep.
Yep.
And but the difference between doing that as, or being the janitor, which I also did,
Mm.
you know as just an employee. You're just the janitor, you're just the guy pushing the broom, versus you're the owner of the business, you're a co-owner of a business. Like, that's huge. And to me, working in a lot of these jobs while I was in college and after, um, it really hit me like, wow, I've been doing this for like a decade, about, and it's like wearing on me,
Yeah.
the disrespect, like the lack of any kind of social respect that you get.
Yeah.
Even as a house painter, it was tough in that regard. And it's like, and I think about like, I worked with some people who were very bitter, sour people, And
Yeah.
it was I knew why. I knew why, because they had been being treated, like that, and seeing themselves for so long. Like, yeah, it just wears on you. So,
Yeah, you're going
I
to
think,
internalize it at some point. And,
yeah,
the reasons why the bosses are behaving that way, I'm certain has a lot to do with how they've experienced personal worth and self-worth and like how they were taught to be in a way. Like there's a lot of reasons for it and it's all bad. Right?
and even if you have the best boss in the world, it doesn't matter if when you're working at the nursing home. I'll just name jobs I've had at the nursing home as a housekeeper, or you're working, the graveyard shift at the gas station. It's the customers, it's everybody else, it's your in-laws, or you're hopefully going to be in-laws someday when you're sitting at the dinner table and they ask you what you do for a living and you tell them and they're like,
Yeah.
oh, and they don't ask you anything else about that. Like,
Right. And if you were to be able to say to them in that moment, I work at a bakery versus I co-own a bakery, there's something very
yes,
different about,
exactly.
right? And that
Exactly.
really, even though, it's the actual work that you're doing, I'm still making croissants, right? But I'm making croissants in the knowledge that I'm making those croissants to pay my and my colleagues' paychecks to make our community enriched. Right? Like I am in charge of that. Even if I'm no, of course I need to be there from 2 to 10 because croissants, like entropy doesn't care. Physics don't care if you're there on time or if you want to be late. No, the dough is going to rise at a certain rate. You better be ready for it, right? So there are constraints. I'm not saying that way is like a fucking holy grail, but it does matter. It does matter. And in
Yeah.
ways that I weep for the people who have bought into the myth that the way to win is to get to the top so you can oppress others. um, like I weep for them and their souls because that doesn't have to be the way. You didn't have to put in that time being degraded. You could have been empowered the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really one of my main motivations for going around helping other co-ops come into existence, or even just shifting any business a little bit more toward the cooperativist side of the spectrum, because it minimizes the suffering in the world. And hopefully that will help us all be better in the systems that I do have to live under, because we can't control all of the systems, right? We live under an interesting nation state in this moment, and we live
Mm-hmm.
constrained by so many things, and I can't do things about that, but I can do things about changing the small moments of empowerment in the lives of the people around me, and they go on to build businesses, parent people, our customers themselves, vote, etc. And so I actually look at cooperativism as not just a project of meeting a specific need, housing, daycare, whatever. I look at it as a project of actually participating in creating better citizens and society members around us. Like when you have to cooperate, you have to work on certain things and ways of being, and you get the benefits of doing that, and then you carry those out into the rest of the world. Or at
Yes.
least you have the opportunity to do so. Not everyone chooses to that, but hey, you at least are more likely to be set up to choose empowerment, to choose respect, to choose cohabitation, and not just winner take all.
Yeah. And you have when you have the experience of a functional cooperative project in your past, I mean, that makes all the difference in the world. And unfortunately, the opposite can also be true. People
Yep.
who have had just experiences of dysfunctional cooperatives in their
Yeah.
past can sometimes be like the least, like they don't want,
Yeah, they're like,
try kind of thing.
I'm allergic to that. And that, of course, right? I think but it to me, it feels a little bit like when folks are like, oh, well, I see, I had an experience of divorce that was terrible in my life, or I had an experience of this like queer family that blew up and therefore all queer families are terrible. It's like, no, actually, all businesses are subject to potential failure. All groups of people are subject to potential drama. That doesn't mean that this way of gathering people doesn't have a better hit rate at not being terrible than this way of
Yeah.
gathering groups of people.
Yeah, I mean, what I like to say to people is, because I'll be talking about co-ops, and they'll bring up like, oh, well, this problem and that problem, that you would, hypothetically have, and it's like, well, yes, everything has problems. It's just what kind of problems do you want to have? I would prefer to have the ones where I have some say,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly that. Exactly. Like, you were not going to escape from problems. Sorry, being on top, doesn't actually solve all of your problems. So that end goal is a myth. Sorry, hun. Which problems would you like to sign up for the rest of your finite time on this earth?
Right.
The
Yeah.
ones where you get to have basic respect and collaboration, or the ones where you have to either be subject or subjugated? Which one?
And
I'm
even
like,
if it all goes wrong, I would prefer to know that, like, I had something in it. It wasn't just I was, at the mercy of some guy or woman or person, high up the chain of command who decided that we need to make some money by firing a bunch of people a day or whatever.
so I
Um,
can actually speak to that directly from the second worker co-op I was a part of in a very like tangible way, because that was the first business I've ever been a part of that we decided to close. We decided to close that business while we were inside it and while it was profitable. Which was it felt insane to at least one of our members and many of our collaborators, but we did it for really valid reasons. And it really, like, what happened, the broad context is it was a catering company, and it was converted to a worker owned business, as a part of the succession plan, as a part of this, large wave of converting to worker co-op as a succession plan rather than closing or selling the business. That's a model that folks like Project Equity and others that have come after them are really trying to bring around in the world right now, really trying to pursue as an engine of more employee ownership and empowerment. So it was one of those. I came in because I had food service expertise and cooperative expertise. So I was the third worker owner member officially. And we came together, made a strategic plan. We said we're going to ground and anchor. We're gonna really get solid on our business model this year. We intend to add one member by the end of the year, add two members by the halfway through the next year, and then add a client, and then obtain a kitchen in a new location, like shared kitchen space lease, so that we can diversify who we're serving. Solid strategic plan, good benchmarks, ready to go. We kept going, and then at the end of that year, we had gained a member, and then when we were just poised to start our next year's strategic planning process, we lost that member, and all of our leads for whether or not we could have a kitchen space fell completely through, because the Bay Area was really experiencing a high volume of need and not enough kitchens. And so we were like, okay, we just slid backwards on our benchmarks. We're looking around. We have an injury on the team that's related to our work. We're not progressing on the timeline that our conversion needed to, and we're looking at a bad situation. What are we going to do together? And we sat down and had a 3-hour collective meeting where we really went through it. And I brought from my toolkit a spreadsheet that I use to help groups make really complex decisions where, like, your head and heart are involved, where there's a bunch of different factors that you're trying to weigh against each other and they're not really comparable. It's just like a way to help compare high stakes oranges and apples together and then come out with a number that tells you what you want to do. And we ran a process together in the group where we filled out the spreadsheet alone, compared the numbers, really talked about it, really tried to figure out where is our differences of opinion seated. Are they seated in like a mindset of scarcity versus abundance? Are they seated in like a literal analysis of the numbers and the market research that we did? Like, what's the situation? And then we ran the process again, and we came out with a pretty clear vote of, we actually want to close the business because we don't have faith that we can meet everybody's needs, the succession of the owner within a certain time frame, the wages that people were going to need in order to stick with it for their family and life plans, and the ability to grow and bring on new members within a time frame that would make all that possible. We were like, we don't actually think we can do it. We've done the research, we've tried, and we don't think it's possible. So we're going to vote to close the business while we're still profitable and while we still have money in the bank, because then we can allocate some of that money to each of us to be seed fund for our next adventure. And that feels like a more workers appropriate use of our resource, which is this shared asset, this business. And it was really hard. And it had, people had some really big feelings, including the person who'd founded the company, who was like, I didn't set out on this journey to close my business, but I did set out on this journey to make sure that it was a shared business and not in my hands anymore. And this does meet that need. And one thing that was just really game changing in terms of dignity was one of the other two worker owners, who is now since passed, rest in power. He had experienced a lot of homelessness in his life. He had experienced being well below the poverty line for most of his life. And this was, as a part of our bylaws, we had to if we dissolved, which this was a cooperative dissolution, if we dissolved, we had to put a portion of our reserve surplus funds back into the community. It was in our bylaws that we had to gift back into the community that had helped birth us. And we decided it was about I think it was $10,000 that we were going to disperse, and we just ran a process. We were like, who do you want to give it to? And it was the first time in his life that he had gotten to be a benefactor and write $1,000 checks to people. And he was like, it was actually completely game changing for him. Like, we had a conversation later as he's like, I had never been the benefactor. I had always been the recipient. And I like walk differently through the world now because I have gotten to be a part of that. So it wasn't just that he got the seed fund to go and start his next thing, which ended up being a small catering company, because that was separate from that. He also got like this access to this like next level of dignity that he didn't know was on the table to be had. And it was really powerful to like witness and hold him in that. And then also I came up in a mixed class family. I've never gotten to write $1,000 checks to people. That was a whole new situation. And it really like both demystified capital to me and made it more like tangibly accessible, and also just felt really good. It feels good to be able to give back. And like our bylaws told us we had to, and so we did. And that was all just really a really powerful, like the most successful failure I've ever been a part of. And it was that successful and in those ways because we had committed to cooperating in a cooperative fashion, and our legal structure held us in that commitment and held us well. So yeah, it was a really interesting way to be briefly a worker owner of a business and then to lose a business.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it doesn't sound like a failure to me. If there's no reason why the only version of success is it lasts forever, and keeps doing
Exactly.
its thing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and yeah, for sure, being on the opposite end, being able to, like you said, that being in the position of writing the checks rather than receiving them, but then also like having that come out of a group that supported that. It's not, whereas generally in our society, if you want to get into the position of somebody who's writing out 4 or 5 figure checks, it's something that you've done individually, right? It's all about like, and this is my checkbook.
I am now a philanthropic, robber baron, as it were, and I have this money to give, or even just you're like, I'm deciding that I'm going to set aside a portion of my money that I gathered, and I'm going to do this. Either way,
it's all on you,
right? It's all on you, and it continues the individualistic situation. Whereas this was like, no, we as a group understand and commit to each other and to the entities and people that supported us in coming into existence, that like we owe back into this ecosystem, back into this way of being, and we're going to stand by that, and we're going to do that with each other. It's a different way of doing it, and it also had these, right, like I can learn about your positive giving and be like, oh, that's cool, but I can like share a pot of money with you and then decide what we're going to do with it, and that just is really cool.
So we've talked quite a bit about your past. Can you tell us more about what you're doing currently and what your work with co-ops and different groups entails now?
Yeah. So I like to say I'm a serial worker co-opper. I can stop whenever I want, but no, I don't want to. So I tend to, my life is currently continuing to follow the pattern of my life since 2008, which is I run Sassy Facilitation, which I got nicknamed by a fellow housing co-opper, Sassy. I can't imagine why. Branded my business that when I needed to start a company to take a 1099 to help a co-op out of a tight spot, and then just kept going with that. And so I support co-ops. I tend to work intentionally across sectors, like I mentioned before, because people are going to people, and we tend to silo even when we don't intend to sometimes, because it's just a natural outgrowth of doing deep work sometimes. But the housing co-ops don't necessarily talk to the worker co-ops, don't necessarily talk to the consumer co-ops, etc. And sometimes the credit unions forget that they're even co-ops. And so there's a lot of, and even then within each of those, they tend to, well, the carpet consumer co-ops and the producer co-ops of this sector, talk to them. So I intentionally try and bridge all of those things. So I teach at conferences a lot. I did the worker co-op conference, the California co-op conference, which I helped found back in 2009. There's a lot of, I go to the places where the community gathers and the ecosystem gathers. I'm really excited to kind of be deepening more into other parts of that. So I've just started, I attended the Co-op Impact Conference put on by NCBA once. I'm going to try and go to other industry convenings just to like learn. And there's certain things that every co-op has to deal with. How do you do member engagement? What does it look like to have a functionally representative board? How do we balance representing the interests of the people inside the co-op with our own member interests? There's so many components of like governance and operations that are shared across all kinds of co-ops. And so my interest is really in learning as many of those as possible, inhaling as many different methodologies and tools and structures for holding people in groups together and having them agree or at least work on collaborating better. And so I read a lot, I learn a lot, I teach classes, and then I work with co-ops and other kinds of clients. I work with basically anybody who's trying to do something better together, right? So that looks often like, so I'll just run you through like, who did I work with in 2024? I worked with a bunch of land trusts, local in the Bay Area. There's 10 local land trusts that have gotten together to try and be a coalition. And many of those land trusts also have houses in them that are cooperatively owned and managed. So sometimes I'd be working with the folks at the nonprofit level of the land trust, trying to help them think about policy and practice in better ways, or helping them facilitate better dialogue with their members or with their constituents. And then sometimes I'd be in the trenches with a house that was in danger of failing because they were not getting along for 20 years and they couldn't pass a budget. And I'd be in the trenches trying to help them untangle those interpersonal dynamics. I worked with a really large foundation that is trying to support the next economy and the solidarity economy with while also trying to bring non-solidarity economy norms to that practice. And I help them try and figure out how to do that with as much grace and the best of both worlds and the worst of neither. And that looks like a lot of like just facilitating regular working meetings once a week with a group that just needs a neutral outsider to represent a third point of view or no point of view and let them have their points of view. So just holding space. And then I worked with an organization that I'd worked with about 5 years ago that had put together a strategic plan. They're a more eco-village type community, got a lot of different plans, a lot of different members, a lot of different legal structures, and they had a real good vision for how it was going to go. And here we are post-COVID, and none of it went to plan. And they're really trying to figure out, what do they do now? Right? And they've all put in 10, 12 years of their lives and money into this. Some of them have raised kids together, and they're trying to figure out, what do we do next with this land, these relationships, these assets, these buildings that are crumbling? What do we actually do? And so I'm holding them through a whole process of trying to resolve some conflicts and actually assess what they should be doing in the community and what the community needs from them, and then how to build a business model around that. So there's a whole bunch of different sides of this, and that's just like the client stuff. Then, I just joined Cooperation Works, so I'm having lots of nerdy conversations with fellow co-opers and co-op practitioners. I'm supporting Start.coop. We're about to pilot, trying to do a really fast way to help people incorporate without using all of their startup money on legal fees. There's a whole bunch of different kind of aspects of the ecosystem that I'm also just trying to show up in, partly because I'm nerdy and partly because that's how it works to build a movement together and build a model together. So that's kind of all the stuff I'm up to. I'm definitely a bridge builder and a kind of an ecosystem wandering facilitator is kind of the main way that I show up. And I like that for me because I like flexibility and autonomy. I also like collaboration a lot. And so I get to collaborate with all these different kinds of groups. And for myself, whenever I've been in a worker co-op situation or the worker self-directed nonprofit, which ran a co-op that I haven't told the story of here, when I'm in it, I really understand and value having that neutral person available who knows the situation and knows the lay of the land, but isn't in the crew. And isn't in the, like, you're in the family, but you're not at the table and you don't care. Like, I don't, when I'm being that person, I don't care at all what you do. I don't have a stake in the outcome. I just want you to do it cooperatively and very, very well. That's all I care about. And having someone who can hold that space is sometimes the difference between it working and not. And so that's something that I feel like both meshes with how my life has been and how what a gift that I can really give back to the co-op community, because sometimes you really just need that. And then you can do so many things.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I've served as that kind of person, that um, exterior party who just kind of is there to, I don't know, I don't even know what I was exactly supposed to be doing, but having a
Be
little
the
bit more
adult in the
experience.
room.
Yes, well, that is what somebody said, exactly those words, but it's I guess was having a little bit more experience of co-ops, at least knowing people to ask about things and where to look for information, and at least knowing what the best practices were and are. What I ran into was I didn't know what to do or if I should have done anything when, you present the best practices, do trainings or whatever, and everybody's like, yeah, this is great, let's do that. And then that's the last you hear about sociocracy.
Yeah.
It's like, we've all agreed that we're going to do it. Do we ever practice it? No.
Yeah.
On occasion, we'll do a round,
Yeah.
and it's like, and from my perspective, like, the first time I really like done this or been asked to serve that role, I didn't, it was like, part of me wanted to like smack people around and be like, okay, no, you said you wanted to do this. You're going to do it. But of course I can't, I can't
Nope.
do that. And then,
And
they didn't apply it and things didn't work out for what, could be possibly like easily foreseeable reasons, because you weren't applying the the best practices. I don't know. Do
yep.
you have anything?
I mean, to quote the late great Douglas Adams, to summarize the summary of a summary, people are a problem.
Yeah.
Um, and it's exactly that. And that's something I've learned more and more in different, and I've had that lesson from different co-ops in different amounts in different ways. I had a very sharp lesson for the very first client I had, which is Berkeley Student Co-ops, on you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And if the horse thinks you're the man, then you really can't even lead it to water. And so there's a lot in there that's really important as like a participant practitioner in these things. But one of the things that I've learned and do now is that if I'm going to work with a group, even if they don't ask me to, I check up on them. And I check up on them at regular intervals after we work together. And I tell groups, they're like, oh, we can fix this we can do this in like a few weeks. I'm like, triple that time for me. Because it turns out people are, especially people who are already operating a business or an entity or what, nobody's just doing this. Nobody's just building a co-op or just operating a co-op. We all have lives. We have all these complicated things. And, often they're intersecting with the co-op. So it's not like you can pour 100% of your energy and time into just like becoming the person who can suddenly effortlessly reach for sociocracy when I'm pissed off at my colleague, right? Like, that's not a thing. You have to build in time for humans to human with each other, and you have to make that okay. And your job, like my job, a lot of my job is honestly just holding space for people to like grapple with how hard it is to be humans together in groups. Like, a lot of what I do is just being like, yeah, does it feel hard? Congratulations. You have an accurate perception of reality. It's hard. That's so much better than not having an accurate perception of reality. And now let's think through some ways we can make it a little bit less hard, or at least more effective payoff for the hard that you're putting in. So that's honestly a lot of my job. Is really just holding space for that complex truth with groups of people, and then keeping them on the road of, but you committed to this way, we're gonna stick with it until such point as like it's either worked or the data's come back and told you it hasn't, and then we'll change. But we're not just going to pretend that will be an instant fix. because there isn't. And we are going to stick to our cooperative operations and principles as we do it, because that's actually the point, and that's how we believe we're going to get the best outcome as well. So we're really going to do that, even though it may feel easier in this moment to reach for these other narratives or value sets or ways of being that you inherited or that you imbibed, like water, as we all grew in this non-cooperative economy and non-cooperative nation. We're not going to reach for those. I'm going to help you not do that with some structures, with some practices. And that's just, that's most of what I do in different shapes and sizes and forms. And so it takes a
Yeah.
certain
I
optimism,
mean,
which is
maybe
its
if
own.
people are paying for your time, they would be they're more likely to take your advice and actually follow through on the things. I mean, mine was completely volunteer, so
There
I
is absolutely psychology at play there, for sure. It's one of the reasons why, even when I do pro bono work, which I do, there are a lot of groups that can't afford my rates. I charge them the full rate, and then I give them a discount. Because there is absolutely psychology there about value that is weird, but hey, I don't care if it's weird if it works.
Right. So we're getting close to the end of our time here. Last question for you. In your experience with co-ops and working with all these different co-op groups, what would you say is something that is the most often neglected or ignored, or is just often neglected by co-ops that you wish co-ops would focus more on?
Oh boy. Making the money pencil out. That is the biggest one for a lot. And I unfortunately say this especially grounded in the worker co-ops that I've been a part of. And this has to do a lot with like two main things, one of which we don't have control over, which is that most, especially worker co-ops, especially in the United States, most of them are a like survival strategy, right? Like we don't have access to work, let alone dignified work, or there aren't good jobs in our community, or there aren't like opportunities for us to participate in this. So we're going to make one. We're going to make one. And so that's fundamentally a scarcity environment, not just like a mentality, but like literally there aren't dollars. And so that one is hard, because if there isn't literally funding for you to put a down payment on the house to purchase it so you can turn it into a co-op, or actually pay all the bills, that's really hard. So there's that part of not penciling it out. But then there's the, hey, like I cannot tell you how many times. I'll tell you, this is a perfect example. I was part with Hillary Abel and Ricardo Nunez over at Selk. I was part of an effort to start a worker co-op academy inside a local community college system back in like 2014. And I led the people in culture session. There were a few other sessions. I was a volunteer teacher for that session, and we did I was a bunch of the folks in the room were people in idea stage or startup or pre-startup worker owned co-ops that we're trying to get off the ground, right? And we're trying to train people how to be business co-owners together. And we did the whole, like, what do you need in order to have an excellent operational culture at your organization? And it was this beautiful dialogue, all this brainstorming, really great, rich stuff about how to be values centered, how to like be, inclusive structurally, how to have good and dignified operations that meant that you had like valuable work where you were seen, etc. And nowhere on there did they say a viable business model. Right? No one was focused on the brick and mortar of how do we actually make sure we have a company that has revenue in order to have a company inside which we are thriving and Jedi focused and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is that, like, and the downstream things of like being excellent at marketing, understanding like cogs, like all the businessy stuff that, to be fair, most of us are alienated from intentionally because of how our school system works. We don't get, but co-ops tend to be overly focused on how do we like come together with excellence, and under focused on how do we make sure that we are a functioning business or financially viable entity. Big housing co-op, same. Like if you've got a big housing co-op and the board members don't know how to pass a budget that means that their houses won't fall down in 20 years, same. Like there is a skills gap and a cultural lack of focus there, for mostly reasons that have to do with people like rejecting things or not having the information and feeling alienated from it. But whatever it is, we're not as good as we need to be in some places of the co-op world at actually being business competent. Um, and we need to get over that and reclaim it for ourselves and just do it. Like, we need to take the economy back in its truest sense of the word, in that this is about home management. This is the management of our lives, and resources are integral to that. And it's not selling out or being a capitalist pig to actually just know how to make numbers work.
Yeah, for sure. This, I mean, it reminds me a lot of the guy from Works. I can't remember what his name is offhand. The worker co-op printing, like clothes
Yes.
printing. But he gave an interview and he said he went to see it was like a post-mortem on a couple of worker co-ops that had failed, and he went hoping to hear about, like some insightful stuff, and he said he came away from it thinking, well, those were just two really obviously bad business ideas. There's just like, why'd you think those would work in the first place? And yeah, that is for sure. That's an issue.
And like, that's great. It doesn't have to be a business, is I think the corollary to that. Be like, great, you have a great idea, but it's not actually a good business idea. Make another kind of mutual aid or creative community structure about it. That's fine. That can be done.
Right.
Don't put numbers in it if the numbers don't work, but have the discernment to know that. That's what I really would love to see the co-ops get better at. Is
make sure to have a couple pessimists in your group too. I think that helps, because obviously it's going to be lots of optimists often in our groups, and we need to have a couple of sourpusses like.
Yeah, and that's why I actually one of my favorite roles when I run meetings, especially if there's a strategic planning process, I make people wear a tiara and a devil hat. And I'm like, you're the designated optimist and you're the designated pessimist. Your job is to poke holes in every idea, and your job is to see the bright side of any situation. So if we don't have those designated, it's going to be a bad strategic planning session.
Oh wow! Okay, I might steal that for our next session.
Take it. It is for the movement.
All right. Well, thank you, Kate, with that. I think we will let you go and get off to your next thing. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for holding down the legit best ecosystem newsletter. It's the only one I actually read all of. It rocks. Wow. Keep doing it.
Do that.